Hello there. Are you, too, worried about the recent geopolitical climate involving the 4 global superpowers? Are you, too, concerned, afraid that the Chinese People's Liberation Army could come knocking on your door anytime, demanding you answer in fluent Mandarin? Then I got the solution to your problems. Genshin, and in particular Liyue Lore, not only is it so dense that you will lose your time, your job, your loved ones, and ultimately your sense of self trying to comprehend it all, ultimately allowing you to forget the dire state of this fickle world, but also you will be learning a variety of words originating from several Chinese dialects, including of course Mandarin, but also classical Chinese. This will, in case of an invasion, allow you to, in response to soldiers in front of your door, say 小孩小. It's told that it will result in one of the soldiers getting close to you and softly whispering something into your ear. You will not understand the things uttered because Genshin is a horrible way to learn any language without vast amounts of additional input, and so you will be shot shortly after, still not knowing what exactly was said to you. That is to say, forgive me in advance because every single Chinese name in this video will be butchered, leaving me with 2 options. Either I can just not try in the first place and pronounce everything John Lee adjacent, or I can try inevitably just sounding kind of racist. I will be going with the second option. Just note that the horrible pronunciations don't come from a place of ethnicity-based discrimination, they come from a place of utter incompetence. In this video, I will obviously be covering Liyue Lore. I will go by area because doing it chronologically for the entire area would be confusing as fuck. I do also want to note here that this is ultimately far from everything that could be said. I'm not a Genshin lore scholar, I'm a reformed Xiangling addict trying to make content independent of her binding shackles. Remember when you first entered Liyue? Likely you followed the quest of a chef whose name will not again be mentioned, instructing you to obtain peppers, in which case the Bishi Plain was your first area in Liyue. Or alternatively, you could have gone through an autistic journey climbing over all of Dragonspine only to end up flattened by what I presume are the unpaid interns' final attempts to sabotage the game out of spite. Like, what the actual fuck is wrong with these guys? Anyways, historically, the Bishi Plain has been a relatively quiet area. Nowadays, its biggest settlement is Xingxie village, basically a farming village turned retirement home. However, it is said that Xingxie is the name of an ancient dragon, rumored to lie dormant under the village after defeat at the hands of Morax, the Geo-Archon. Perhaps in a future update it will be set free as a ploy by the Xixing to avoid further payments to a village that by its very nature only takes and doesn't give back. However, that is just a theory. To its west lies Wang Hill, where at one point in time another thriving village was located. However, nowadays it's entirely vacant, giving off a very spooky vibe. At one point in the distant past, legends tell of a whale-tailed monster charming the village's youths and leading them away north to their doom. This whale-tailed monster is probably the nearby Oceanid. I don't fucking know why it would do that, but it's French, so honestly I'm not even that surprised. It would kill every young person in the village, leaving the old to rot and die. Classic move. Then lastly there's Saltare, on, around and below which was at one point established a domain under the protection of Havria, goddess of salt. She was widely considered to be a kind ruler but also a weak one, and as such over the course of the Archon War her territory shrunk and shrunk, eventually only leaving her and her people with a tiny island. Fearing for the safety of their benevolent ruler, the inhabitants of the underground city, built to shield from the devastation above, resorted to the only reasonable and logically sound solution: stabbing Havria with a sword right into her chest. This act resulted in everyone in Havria's vicinity to be turned into a statue of salt. Would Xiangling, if given the chance, create a sumptuous stew out of these victims of their own idiotic decisions? Probably. There were, however, survivors who would for the most part move to Liyue Harbor and dominate the salt trade there. And because admitting to the extreme failure of your own bloodline is hard, nowadays it is said that Havria was quite powerful actually, some even going to the length of power scaling her, resulting in portraying the deceased goddess as being able to beat Goku, the accuracy of which could be debated. This hyper-buffed Havria was then supposedly assassinated by Morax, which left her people quite salty. Get it? No. I'm sorry. To Liyue's east and bordering on Dragonspine, Kongji Estuary mostly consists of the Guili Plain and the Bingyuan village surroundings, the latter of which used to be thriving with the mining activity. However, at some point the reserves ran dry, prompting a relocation to the chasm and resulting in the village mostly being left to crumble. To this day you can still read letters left in the village. Who was Erge and what happened to him? I don't know, and sometimes things are in fact better left lost from record. Moving west to the Guili Plain, the abundance of ruins tells the story of a once thriving empire, and indeed in the distant past, before the Cataclysm, before the Archon Wars, the Guili Assembly maybe was Liyue's biggest civilization ever, easily outscaling the modern harbor and the few villages scattered about. It was founded by two gods who are also the namesake of the area, Guizhong, the Lord of Dust, and a god whose name at the time is unknown, only surviving in parts in the Li part of Guili. Now he is better known as Morax, the Geo-Archon, or alternatively as it basically stretched over the entire length of the from the Stone Gate at Mondstadt's border all the way to western Mount Xiangheng, perfectly protected by the mountain range once raised by Morax, in addition to the Guizhong Ballistae, a collaborative creation between its namesake and Cloud Retainer. Northwards, it's quite likely the Bishi River served as a continuation of the Guili Assembly's natural border to the western Lisha civilizations, to which I will come shortly. Thanks to its location, the Assembly was an immensely powerful trading hub connecting the Lisha civilizations and their immense export of ore from the chasm to the northwestern Chenyu Vale and their tea, as well as Don Winery and the entirety of Mondstadt, not to forget Inazuma. Now honestly, the timeline is quite blurry, so I don't know if at that point in time Chenyu Vale already was the prolific exporter of tea it is today, and same goes for the Don Winery, as at that point the chasm and the Vindagnia civilizations had just about fallen, and since their downfall was responsible for the rise of habitation in Chenyu Vale and Mondstadt respectively, a lack of existence surely would have been bad for exports in those areas, but I digress. I'll get into the chasm later, and hey, if you're wondering about the Vindagnia, I've got a whole ass video on Liyue Lore. It is quite possibly garbage, but hey, you've got nothing better to do anyways. And if you do, rest assured knowing that what I tell you now is of significantly more significance than anything you could be doing right now, including work, studying, homework, and similar, because surely you want to know how this grand empire fell. Well, the Archon Wars. How surprising. Around 3,700 years ago, a battle within the borders of the domain took place. Who invaded, we don't know. The reason for their invasion, we also don't know. How they got into the borders in the first place, we yet again do not know, though legends state that an enemy clan led by a short king selectively bred their warriors, leading every single one of them to be under 6 foot. It is said that thanks to their incredibly short stature, they were able to covertly enter the Guili Assembly, though there are several theories on what exactly they did to accomplish the feat. Some tales suggest they were able to comfortably fit into the digestive tracts of horses, smuggling themselves into the borders via the trade roads. Some go even further, stating that entire squads of pygmy partisans could be transported within a single wine crate, thus allowing the short king to win the fight, in which the Dihua Marsh sank, resulting in its current state. Also, Guizhong was killed, as rumored, by accidentally tripping over a 5'11" mini militiaman, failing to see him molding on the ground and cracking her head open on an inconveniently placed pebble, though we should keep in mind that these are legends, and so we will never know. This chain of unfortunate events led the area to crumble entirely, and Morax led his people south, establishing Liyue Harbor, making a contract with the Adepti, which had them protect the harbor. Notably, among those Adepti was Gan Yu, who in one battle was swallowed whole by a monster. Thankfully though, at the time, Morax had yet to place sanctions on Ronald McDonald as well as home delivery services, leading to a vast majority of Liyue Harbor's population to be morbidly overweight. Such was the case for Ganyu, and so the monster, ignorant of Ganyu's absolute girth, being fit for an appearance on TLC Trash TV and trying to lure her, inevitably asphyxiated, sparing Ganyu's life. Shortly after, fast food locations and delivery services were banned entirely, and an emphasis was put on educating the common folk as to what was to be considered healthy eating habits. Recreating those same historical guidelines, here I have the typical Liyan food, as eaten during the Archon Wars in a day for you. Starting off the morning by injecting a needleful of government-issued substances increasing blood flow and brain activity, followed by a bowl of cereal. Milk first. For lunch, oftentimes you would eat rice, but since electronic rice cookers had not yet been invented, the grain was consumed as is. That may have been followed up by a light afternoon snack consisting of a single Jueyun chili, eaten directly to numb the tingling feeling of maggots infecting one's open wound. The day was then capped off by looking at a single picture of a ham sandwich, injecting another dose of Marx-approved liquid, and lying down on the hard concrete floor to sleep, listening to the sounds of golems getting impaled by geospears 500 meters away from the highly populated low-tax bracket living area. During the Archon Wars, another giant threat was the area east of the harbor, the sea being filled with all sorts of depraved sea monsters. To ensure peace, Morax cast down rock spears, pinning the majority of those monsters to the bottom of the sea, among which was Osail. Surely they will stay there indefinitely. However, over the course of the war, so many gods were slain, their corpses decomposing became quite the problem, as their spirits remained, still holding hatred. While they forgot at whom this hatred was aimed, it brought havoc nonetheless, causing all sorts of monsters, curses and miasmas to endanger the general public. Morax thus employed a subgroup of Adepti, the Yakshas, to combat those residual spirits and end the epidemic. There were many, the actual number remaining unconfirmed. The 5 strongest Yakshas, however, were Besacius, Bananas, Menogius, Indarius, and Alatus. Alatus in particular was previously controlled by an evil god who was defeated by Morax. Morax then granted Alatus the name Xiao. The Yakshas fought the evil spirits for centuries, and over time their own souls amassed karmic debt and slowly corrupted them, leading most of them to either kill each other or disappear entirely, and so eventually Besacius and Xiao would be the only ones left. The decomposing gods problem, however, would only really come to an end with the arrival of a doctor who would introduce a new and radical idea to the people of Liyue Harbor: cremating not only gods but also the dead in general. Wow. Suddenly, evil spirits of the dead, and more importantly, the stench of Grandma's decomposing corpse in the living room along with the rats it attracted, were no problem anymore, as the doctor founded Wangxiong Funeral Parlor, specializing in the ritual of Homa, or, cremation. Also, I forgot to mention it, but when Liyue Harbor was first established, Morax taught his people how to build homes and created the first minted Mora, which would slowly establish itself as internationally recognized currency, replacing the knockoff Yu-Gi-Oh card trade system previously popular in many areas outside of Inazuma, the only nation to be in possession of the genuine articles. Now, as we all know, at some point roughly 2000 years ago, the Archon Wars came to an end, and Morax took his respective throne in Celestia. With that, those gods which were defeated but refused to live under the dominion of the Seven fled Tevat, escaping to the Dark Sea. This area is said to be riddled with ruins of the Sealy, a race that, before being reduced to the pathetic blue orbs we find, was somewhat of a guiding civilization to humanity. However, at some point, long before the Archon Wars, it fell due to reasons to which I'll get in the Chasm section. Also, following the end of the Archon War, Liyue became increasingly wealthy, and the 7 most prosperous companies, if you want to call them that, founded the Liyue Xixing, which would from that point on govern the economy of Liyue Harbor under the guidance of Morax, who would descend once a year during the rite of, dissension. After Morax's apparent death during the Liyue Archon quest, though spoiler it's not 1.0 anymore, the Xixing consolidated his power, basically becoming the governing body for all matters, not just commerce, fully in the know that Morax was still alive and voluntarily relinquished his post, wanting the Xixing to take it up. West of Liyue Harbor and directly next to the chasm lies Lisha, which nowadays is mostly uninhabited by humans. However, as indicated by the massive ruins in the region, that wasn't always the case. At some very early point in Liyue's history, maybe even long before the establishment of the Gyali Assembly, an unnamed civilization ruled over by a supposedly evil god built what would later be known as Xingqiu Pool, Lingju Pass, and Dunya Ruins, all of those were pronounced correctly. However, at some point, the entire area was submerged underwater, only reappearing once the Archon Wars had ended. As I'll get into later, there was a possibly Tevat-wide flooding event that took place. However, based on the few details that are on the exact timeline, I'm pretty sure this specific flooding of the Liyue region was entirely unrelated, as the said Tevat-wide flooding occurred sometime towards the end of the First Era, a time period upon which I'll again elaborate in the chasm section. As to why the Liyue civilization went underwater, well, there are legends of the evil god granting villages within his domain reprieve from storm and tides in exchange for a human bride, only to, at times, still flood them. More importantly, that does indicate that the area was, and maybe still is, susceptible to floods, completely barring divine retribution. There seems to be, based on the extremely low LOD landmass south of Liyue, a sizable river originating in the same ocean connecting Liyue to Inazuma, so maybe that river was responsible for the floods, but who knows. Anyways, during the time before the Archon Wars, the Liyue civilization was, as previously mentioned, the main source of mining produce for a vast area, trading with the Gyali Assembly, which again, as mentioned, had trade routes to Mondstadt, Inazuma, and Shenyu Vale if that was already inhabited at the time. Also, one more thing to note here is that apparently Dunya Ruins stayed inhabited and thus presumably unflooded during the time the rest of Liyue was underwater, only being abandoned during the Cataclysm. However, there is not much known on what the people did there, so it kind of doesn't really matter, I guess. Now, while Minlin is one of Liyue's biggest areas in terms of landmass, there isn't really a whole lot of lore to go through, as its mountainous terrain has left the region mostly untouched by human civilization. Besides the terrain, that's also due to Jueyun cores and the entire region northwest of it being the domain of the remaining Adepti, and thus no one dares enter in fear of angering them, except for furries, in whose case aggravating and subsequently being assaulted by the Adepti may be the desired result. Though I wouldn't know, I'm not into getting spanked nor a furry. There are some ruins in the very east of Minlin, however, based on their architecture and relatively small scale, it can be assumed that they were a border region or outpost of the Gyali Assembly and as such have been forsaken for millennia. The only other traces of civilization are south of Nantianmen in the Tianxu Valley. All that's known is that it used to be a prosperous settlement, and as such it probably fell under the Liyue civilization, as it's extremely close to it and too small to be its own distinct kingdom. It fell when a certain massive geo-dragon ran rampage in the area and has since been abandoned. Now, while geologically the chasm may be one of the newer features of Liyue, when looking at its history, it traces back further than any part of Liyue, at least in the current patch, which at the pace this video has been progressing might as well be fucking 6.0. To steer clear of any derailing tangent, at least for now, let's go back 6,000 years. Preceding that time period, there was a war so great that, I quote, "the heavens collapsed and the earth was rent asunder." How's that war called? If your guess was Great War, then you've apparently got the potential to be next in line as a Rite of Ohio, as that's exactly what they fucking named it. However, I'll get into a bit more detail about it later. Surprisingly barely related, the Seelie. Strewn across most of Tevat, they nowadays, as I'm sure you've experienced countless times, guide travelers to mostly meager treasure. However, back in times during and maybe succeeding the Great War, they were what we would call civilizers, or in this case a civilization of civilizers. Enki in Mesopotamian, Prometheus in Greek, Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerican mythology. They all, in their respective folk tales, were made responsible for enlightening and civilizing humanity in one way or another. Though it should be noted, as is often the case in archaeology and or anthropology adjacent fields of study, that many terms originate from a time in which they were used in unflattering ways, that's to say, racist ways. So we should keep in mind that these civilizations were in fact not in need of a civilizing deity, they were perfectly capable of achieving cool shit by themselves, and all references to these civilizers are barely more substantially rooted in reality than the Seelie, and suggesting otherwise is silly, and anyone who does should should stop. Surely, if one did so regardless, they would not be taken seriously, let alone granted a massive budget for a bogus TV series disguised as actual archaeology. And now imagine if they got a second season of Glee greenlighted, also produced and published. And what if all of those ideas in that theoretical TV show were like the fundamental ideology of the fucking Nazis? Utterly ridiculous, I know. Thank God that was all made up and not real. Right? What? Well, ignoring the worst thing Netflix has funded since, sexy beasts, the Seelie in their role as humanity's guide were a prosperous civilization themselves, building enormous palaces. However, that glory would, as evident by their now almost entirely withered appearance, not last. Finally getting back to that time frame of 6,000 years ago, an ancestor of the Seelie would find themselves enamored with a traveler from afar presumably as in from outside of Teyvat. They went on to marry, being witnessed by the 3 moon sisters. These sisters would take turns riding their silver chariot through the night sky, looking forward to dawn, the only time of day where they could see their loved one, the sun, ascend in their solar chariot. Now, back to the marriage, it, as one might have expected, had disastrous consequences for all involved, as the Seelie and her kin lost their forms and wisdom, condemned to wander the land mourning, while the chariot of the Moon Sisters was overturned and the sisters proceeded to kill each other, only leaving the cold corpse of one in the night sky. Also, as you might imagine, so violently disrupting the delicate cycle of moon and sun had grave implications for the solar chariot as well, causing it to plunge into the westernmost part of Liyue, creating the chasm. There was someone using a chainsaw at some house. Well, anyways, it appears that the chasm had already been inhabited during that time, and I'll get into what I presume is that civilization in a second. For now, to conclude the solar chariot story, it returned to the sky, though how exactly isn't really clear. It was either repaired by that exact civilization or left on its own, spurred by the bloodshed in the chasm during the cataclysm. Speaking of which, before we get back to the truly ancient history of the chasm, let's move forward in time to a point where Morax had probably already established Liyue Harbor, which, as mentioned previously, flourished as a trading hub even without the northern territories, in large parts thanks to the chasm supplying the Liyue civilizations with massive amounts of ore, who would in turn sell that ore to Liyue Harbor, who could profit immensely thanks to their remaining trade routes. However, at some point, earthquakes began shaking the area, and the Geo-Archon Earth, an elemental being that had been slumbering in the ground for millennia, Ajdaha, and granted him vision. That was, however, conditional on Ajdaha not harming a single person, and if he ever should, he agreed to be sealed away once more. Do not ask me how he signed a contract, by the way, I have no fucking clue. As stated once by prolific literature person Oscar Wilde, life imitates art far more than art imitates life, on account of China Shenhua energy accurately imitating Liyue Lore by digging holes deep enough to reach Liyue, and in the process annihilating areas bigger than many a country in continental Europe, which in some cases might be preferable, desirable even, but I digress. Point is, the miners, in exploiting the chasm for every last drop of ore, destroyed the ley lines there, causing Ashtar to riot, which wasn't helped by the fact that over centuries of living with people, his memories began to vanish. And so he forgot the contract and laid waste large parts of the chasm, Tianxiu Valley, adding human habitation there, as well as Nantianmen, where he would eventually be sealed away beneath the Dragon Queller by Morax and the Adepti. Now, not much later, the chasm would yet again be the focal point of destruction, as during the cataclysm, the creatures of the abyss started invading from an iron meteorite that had landed in the region, prompting the events to occur that were related to us in various story, world and event quests. However, I don't feel like summarizing everything. More interesting is what else we find in the Forsaken Caverns. Ancient architecturally distinct ruins, partly upside down, as well as a divine nail at the very bottom of the chasm. To properly explain everything, we have to go back to the Great War to which I alluded earlier and its actors. At one point, Teyvat was ruled by 7 pure elemental dragon sovereigns, mirroring the Archon system in place today. However, nowadays, only the Dendro Dragon Apep seems to be alive in her original form, with Archer, Nuvelet and maybe Devalden merely being reincarnations of the Geo, Hydro and Anemo Dragon respectively. The reason for them barely existing? The Heavenly Principles. They undeterminably long ago invaded Teyvat from the outer reaches, and using the eggshell they were born from separated the microcosm of the world from the universe. The phrasing taken from the Byakuyakoku collections is, as you might have noticed, incredibly vague and borderline indecipherable, but my best guess is that the microcosm of the world exclusively refers to Teyvat, and considering how, despite presumably only being a continent on a larger planet, isolated Teyvat seems, it would kind of make sense. As such, the Heavenly Principles, also known as the Primordial One, would have had, and through the Archons still has, complete authority over Teyvat, which, if it hadn't been severed from the laws and powers of the rest of the universe, might have not been possible. However, considering the world was ruled by 7 dragon sovereigns upon the Primordial One's arrival, naturally war broke out, eventually leading the foremost dragon, Nibelung, to flee to somewhere outside of Teyvat. We'll get to him a little later. Victorious, the Heavenly Principles and its shades started preparing the world for human life, and in time a Teyvat-spanning civilization directly revering the god cropped up, and it's the remains of that exact civilization we see in the depths of the chasm, as well as in Kondomia and now Natlan. However, that doesn't explain why the ruins in the chasm are upside down, as in both Inazuma and Natlan, that so far hasn't appeared to be the case, though I am writing or rather revising this part of the script during version 5.1, now almost 5.2, and as such there's a very real possibility that by the time this video actually does come out, everything I will talk about in the next couple of paragraphs has turned out to be nothing but waffling. Taking that risk regardless, and in doing so explaining the architecture unique to the chasm, we have to continue where we left off, with the Heavenly Principles ruling over a Teyvat-wide civilization sitting in Celestia, which probably started floating in the skies around that time. For an unknown amount of time, this civilization prospered, being able to directly communicate with Celestia thanks to envoys consisting of, but not being limited to, the 4 shades of the Primordial One. However, this quote-unquote world created by the Heavenly Principles was created in a cyclical manner, meaning that at one point all would have to die in order to make room for Teyvat's next iteration. Now, people were of course meant to be kept in the dark about that, so whenever the question about the longevity of their bountiful way of life was brought before the envoys, they would instantaneously and telepathically communicate amongst each other and to the Heavenly Principles, not only to remain silent but also to follow home the Inquirer. As they say, curiosity killed the cat, though in these remote instances the cause of death was most often attributed to old age or simply a lacking intake of vitamin C gummies. Now, over time the people grew discontent with their overlord, so naturally, as any self-respecting god ought to, the Heavenly Principles flooded the shit out of this ancient civilization, killing the majority of it. Now, when looking at the timeline, most early events are very ambiguous when it comes to their placement on it relative to each other, so potentially the chasm was created by the solar chariot prior to the flooding. That's irrelevant because, as you might have seen when exploring the chasm, there's aquatic fossils seemingly embedded in the bedrock, but I'll get to that point. For now is that the chasm must have been underwater for a long period of time, and since, at least based on my experiences, being underwater by several hundred meters in a hole so twisted that reaching the surface must have been a giant pain in the ass is not exactly conducive to, well, living, there seems to be something that does not add up. So, completely going out on a limb, I think events were as such. As, remember, the solar chariot was potentially repaired by the people in the area. Well, the area must have been inhabited by, presumably, the ancient civilization before the chasm came to be. After it was created, the ancients probably used the chasm for mining, as would later civilizations, when at one point the flood came and the people fled into the chasm. I assume that it wasn't immediately submerged, but instead slowly filled with water, allowing the ancients to build their city within the chasm, taking into consideration a partial flooding of the chasm by taking advantage of the high cave ceilings by, yes, building upside down buildings, allowing the buildings to avoid the water, again, assuming it didn't rise too high. Now, these upside-down buildings are only found within the Nameless Ruins sub-area of the chasm. Every other ruin of the ancients appears to have been built regularly. So, fittingly, the ruins in the underground waterway seem significantly more dilapidated and water damaged than the Nameless Ruins, though, to be honest, I could be tripping balls and everything could use the same assets, but it fits nice into my headcanon, so I'll confidently say this as a fact, while it is very possibly horseshit. Also, it has to be noted that the ruins reach into and through the glowing narrows all the way to the Divine Nail and are in a way worse state of disrepair to the point of nigh non-existence, but that's due to another reason to which I'll get in a second. Before we move on, I do also want to point out that the upside down towers feature shafts which have no way up or down, but would be usable if submerged underwater. I'ma be honest, I don't think I want to shit here. Well, regardless of why exactly the buildings were inverted, as I alluded to earlier, the chasm was at one point definitely an underwater biome, otherwise the marine fossils wouldn't, well, be of a very marine nature. Only assuming the chasm drained over time, these fossils could not possibly exist.
See, actually...
Let's assume you get absolutely clobbered in a bar out of town. Naturally, you drive home on your own, maybe hydrating some more along the way. Eventually, you notice something moving in front of your 3-ton 2019 GMC Sierra, but in your inebriation, you fail to swivel around the deer, staring at its impeding doom, and run it over, crushing its bones, organs, and spirit. Of course, you can't leave it on the road and decide to throw it to the side of the road and bury it under a bit of dirt so as to conceal the cold-blooded murder. Now, hidden from predators and the elements, the mangled mammal begins to decompose and over decades and centuries is covered by sediment and eventually petrifies, meaning its bones are slowly replaced by minerals, leaving what is basically a stone cast of its bones behind. All that exposition, entirely unrelated to personal experience, was definitely necessary, as in our case, the fossils are found in bedrock hundreds of meters below the earth in what used to be water, and in these conditions fossils are exceedingly rare. That's in part due to the immense pressure exuded on the bones, causing them to essentially break down before they can be petrified, though there's quite the number of factors that I will, for a change, not ramble about. So basically, these aquatic animals died and were subsequently petrified in an environment different to that in which they had to have lived, in that, well, there couldn't have been any water. It stands to reason then that there was an event that caused all the water to vanish and the animals to die. Incredibly astonishingly, that event was a divine nail performing an action to which there are countless real-world references, so for a change I am not gonna bring one up as that's not very creative. Moving on, and in going back to the land's most ancient history, we can finally talk about the Great War. Nibelung, the foremost dragon sovereign, forked off initially, coming back to Teyvat with forbidden knowledge. At around the same time, a second outsider, similarly to the primordial one, descended, so naturally war broke out. Whether Nibelung and the second descender fought the heavenly principles together, I don't know, but ultimately and importantly, both of them were vanquished. However, the forbidden knowledge brought by Nibelung tainted the land, so to rectify that, the heavenly principles brought down the divine nails upon Teyvat, cleansing it of all corruption, but also sadly causing the death of approximately 100% of all life, as seen in the chasm, with the water being vaporized instantaneously, allowing the animals to petrify. So while the divine nail signified the at least temporary end of habitation in the chasm, it in fact didn't wipe out the civilization, unlike in Vindagni. As the hopefully still most recently released area in Liyue, Chenyu Vale is home to two major settlements, both engaged in tea trade. These leaves, colloquially referred to as the sticky icky, are laboriously harvested in Xiaoying village, employing both children and goats. Child labor is an integral part of the culture and ensures adequate work experience of roughly 10 years once an individual enters the job market. Now, you might see to fail how this woman could be considered a child, but taking into account the properties of the perennial plant, it is very possible that she is actually a 4-year-old child, the growth being expedited and leading her to require hip surgery at the age of 20. The goats, in dealing daily with the verdant valuables, are not only able to produce milk with narcotic effects, but also provide meat that is said to, quote, prolong life beyond its natural span and make the cock girthy and veiny, with those effects being transferred to the animal by merely being in proximity to the leaves. One does not dare imagine its potency in pure form. As such, Chenyu Vale has over time established itself as an immensely important exporter of stimulants, be they caffeine related or otherwise. These exports are being handled in the second settlement of Chenyu Vale, Yilong Wharf, northwest of Xiaoying village. From there, same-day shipping ensures the arrival of the produce in either Lumadus or Baida Harbor. However, there was a time in which the settlements in Chenyu Vale weren't as peaceful as they are now. Well, during the Archon Wars, very surprising. Back then, Chenyu Vale was under the governance of a god who, believe it or not, didn't get too well along with Morax. In fact, the Herb Lord, as they were called, kinda didn't want Morax around. Considering Chen Yuveil's vastly inferior combat strength though, when Morax started invading, the Herb Lord had a genius idea to win nonetheless. The Herb Lord planned to selflessly sacrifice their entire population and flood the Bishi River, driving back Morax's forces and maybe even wiping them out. As you might imagine, the people and some of the local Adepti weren't really fond of that plan, and the Herb Lord was overthrown. Thanks to the fact that the entire area isn't flooded when we arrive, we find murals hinting at something very interesting. Art depicting a group exodus from an area upon which a divine nail is descending. This, of course, is telling the story of the Chasm civilization leaving the chasm during the aftermath of the Great War, unlike a certain other, presumably mostly dim-witted civilization. Considering the flood I previously theorized to have been responsible for the flooding of the chasm and the upside-down buildings took, as far as I know, place before the Great War and thus before the dropping of the divine nails and the chasm civilization's subsequent exodus, this does suggest that the civilization did in fact persist within a flooded chasm for quite some time, validating my theory. Wow. If you're currently surprised by my ability to develop a theory based on so far indisputable facts, I do want to inform you that this entire thing has been a make shit up as I go kind of thing, and as such, the fact that this theory even remotely lines up is a complete fucking coincidence. Now that I have exposed my complete lack of knowledge on both basic research and science procedure, as well as the subject matter with which we have dealt for the past 30 minutes, not that I needed to, realistically that has been awfully apparent the entire time, I think I will call it for now, as honestly, the only pieces of lore I'm actually interested in are almost exclusively related to the old world and the beginning of the new world, and we've run out of things to do with that, at least in Liyue. If you've made it this far, why? And subscribe, because the next video, presumably the Inazuma lore video, will release in approximately 3 years. I actually tried with this one, so seeing this get 20 views while my stupid fucking cookie video from now over 2 years ago sits at 5,000 views will be an aggravating sight, but I do intend to keep smashing my head against the brick wall that is the algorithm until I make it. So until next time, remember to avoid my yaces by eating a whole chili every evening at 6:35, and don't forget to check your horses for growth-stunted warriors.